Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. The World Bank says if the Nigerian government fails to provide palliatives for Nigerians, an additional 7.1 million persons will become poor to make the figure over 100 million. This was disclosed during the launch of the June 2023 edition of the Nigerian Development Update in Abuja. Arise correspondent Punariman Benjamin tells us more.
On the day of President Bola Tinubu's inauguration, one of the most shocking announcements he made was the removal of fuel subsidy. This announcement has continued to spark reactions across Nigeria. The Nigerian Labour Congress and the Trade Union Congress threatened to embark on a nationwide strike, but the government's swift intervention averted more crises with the promise of palliatives to cushion the effect of the subsidy removal. Since then, Nigerians have begun to live with the realities of buying fuel for as high as 570 naira per litre. Some Nigerians supported the government's decision, while others disagree with policy experts saying it is the right decision. However, some who supported the move suggested that the government should have made provisions for palliatives before removing the fuel subsidy to cushion the effect on Nigerians. Members of the House of Representatives also called for President Tinubu to, as a matter of urgency, start the implementation of palliative measures to mitigate the effect. Now, the World Bank reveals that there will be more hunger and suffering among citizens if the Nigerian government refuses to compensate and provide palliatives for many Nigerians. The World Bank adds that the number of poor people in rural areas increased by an estimated 4%, while in urban settings, there was an estimated increase of 11%. It also warns that many newly poor and economically insecure households will likely resort to coping mechanisms such as not sending children to school or not going to the health facilities to seek preventive health care or cutting back on nutritious dietary choices. Although President Tinubu explains that in order to provide financial support and relief, funds must be first budgeted. The government says it is working to increase revenues so that more people can afford basic necessities. Until that is brought into reality, Nigerians may only continue to hope for a better country. Punariman Benjamin, Arise News.
Joining us now on the morning show to discuss the World Bank statement is Professor Uwaleke, Professor of Finance and Capital Market, Nasarawa State University, Kefi, and Paul Alaje, Senior Economist at SPM Partners. Good morning, Professor Uwaleke and Paul Alaje, for joining us. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, quickly, just a straightforward question.
Thank you. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning. Just a straightforward question to both of you. The Nigeria Development Update, June 2023. We've been told in the introduction that we're likely to have more poor people, up to about 7.1 million, that would still join the multidimensional poverty dilemma, hitting over 100 million. But at the same time, the World Bank report says Nigeria is going to make as much as 21 trillion from first subsidy savings between 2023 and 2025. And that if those resources are not well managed, poverty will just continue to gallop. What do you think? What options, what advice will you give to government, even beyond the conditional cash transfer that has been proposed by both the World Bank director and the World Bank lead economist? Let's start with you, Paul Alaje, and then Prof would follow up.
Yeah, thank you so very much. I must say that the World Bank was very apt in some of the things they mentioned in the report that was released, I think, 2 days ago. First, they've mentioned that about 7.1 million people may join poverty line. In fact, the report mentioned that as at May 2023, 4 million people, they've already been added to poverty line. So if you had 7.1 million people, because of inflation, in the understanding of the World Bank, inflation is what pushed more people into poverty. So on one hand, when we're trying to rebuild the economy, it's important for us to know that we have people living in multidimensional poverty, 133 million people, according to the National Bureau of Statistics and UNDP. We should also note that over 89.8 million people as at December 2022. Now, according to World Bank, as at May 2023, we have 93.8 million people. 7.1 million persons may join that population. And the reason are simple to know. One of the reasons is the cost of transportation in the pockets of the poor, talking about the low-income earner, people that earn below 30,000 or maximum 40,000, all of them will become, as a matter of fact, they are already poorer because cost of transportation is taking between 30 to 60% of the income. What commuters are doing today, the least of increase is about 65% in increase of cost of transportation. So, and in some instances, the cost of transportation has even grown more than double. As economic agent, mobility of labor is very significant. Labor cannot produce while it's seated in the same spot. Even if what is selling is the same spot, it might need to restock and a few other things that is very essential for livelihood of labor. So the projection of 7.1 million people joining the poverty bracket is so apt. Again, when you look at those who are living on minimum wage, 30,000 naira, how we calculate whether somebody is living below poverty line, speaking of purely poverty line, is $1.90. So when you divide those living below poverty line by the new exchange rate, which of course is already floated at over 700 naira, you see that that amount has gone to between $1.3 a day to $1.4. So minimum wage is also not reasonable. Definitely, what we see is that government is going to review minimum wage, and the review will be high, more than 60,000 or between 60 to 100,000, depending on where government is settling. I understand labor is even making more demand than what government have said. Okay, so that said, when you now look at what government is expected to generate in the next, say, 3 to 4 years, over 20 trillion naira, according to the report. It is so because when you look at what government estimated for subsidy in half year 2023, it's about 3.3 trillion, 3.3 or 3.6 trillion. When you take that to full year, you are looking at 6.9 trillion, according to the World Bank report. When you multiply that by the number of years, assuming other parameters remain constant, what we call ceteris paribus, what you see is over 21 trillion naira. The question is, 21 trillion naira, how will they be spent? Will we just leave them in the budget, or as we have recommended in our organization, that government should take a different path? You realize that in 2012, President Jonathan created a team to manage funds to be removed from subsidy. And I think that will give us a window of transparency to know what government will do with monies that would have been in the budget ordinarily as subsidy. This is how we can actually mitigate against those that may become poor, by putting the money directly into infrastructure that will cut across all states, that will spread across all local governments, and more importantly, federal government will have impact. If we don't do this, what has happened to subsidy removal in diesel may eventually happen again to subsidy removal on PMS. Diesel, there is no more subsidy. On kerosene, there is no more subsidy. On Jet A1, no more subsidy. The question is, what is the impact directly on the economy of Nigeria? And I am believing that President Bola Tinubu's team will take a different path by saying this is what we should have spent on subsidy, and we're going to invest that. I think in 2012 it was called Sure-P program. I don't know what name it will be called this time. We can call it any name. What is important to economists is the impact on our people, impact on the economy, growth that will be long-lasting and eventually translate into development.
Okay, Professor Uwaleke, your take on the World Bank report.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Ruben. First, let's admit that the reforms are welcome. Whether you are talking about fuel subsidy removal or even unification of exchange rates, I think, the time has come for us to, implement these reforms. But for me, the question has always been, how should that be, done? If you look at the case of oil subsidy removal, for example, it's said that in 2022 alone, fuel subsidy contributed 2.22% of GDP. And I was also looking at GDP reports for Q1 of 2023, where you find that education sector contributed just 1.89% to GDP, health 0.73% to GDP. So what it tells you is that fuel subsidy alone is contributing more than what education is contributing to GDP. And roughly, the combined of education and health, to GDP. So the cost is huge. We can't really continue, along the trajectory. As I said earlier on, the question now becomes how. Now, I also think that the number even being projected by the World Bank, I saw that report, 36-slide presentation, seizing the opportunity. The 7.1 million Nigerians that will be thrown into the poverty, space. If palliatives are not provided, I think that number is even on the low side. Because if you look at that report critically, the analysis was just based on impact of fuel subsidy removal and impact of unification of exchange rate. There was no holistic attempt to actually look at the impact. I think the number could have been more, and even the inflation rate projection, in my view, is also likely to be higher. Why do I say so? The report didn't talk about the potential increase in electricity tariffs. The report didn't talk about the impact of the increase in the VAT that the World Bank is even recommending. In the report, part of the recommendation by the World Bank is that the VAT should be increased. And I think that shouldn't be something we should be talking about now, except we want to put more people into poverty. There's this issue about taxes. We often say the Nigerian VAT rate of 7.5 is among the low, the least in the world. But we also failed to look at the entire, basket of taxes that we have. Yes, it is one of the least in the world, but the other taxes, like direct taxes, for example, the company's income tax, we have one of the highest in the world. Our company's income tax today for large companies is 30%. When you add 2.5% education tax, which is now going to be increased to 3%, you now find that the effective rate is around 33%. In Ghana, for example, yes, VAT is 15% in Ghana, but companies' income tax is 25%. In South Africa, VAT is 15%. Companies' income tax is 27%. So the attempt should be to look at these things holistically, rather than singling them out, because we are talking about poverty here. And the report too is heavily weighted on cash, transfer, again, which is also where I have my reservation. It talks about continuing this conditional cash transfer. And inside in the report too, admitted that even there is also a challenge, the fact that the register we have today only has about 15.7 million households, talking about 44% of household coverages. So the coverage is low. So I would not recommend, again, using conditional cash transfer as a way to, cushion the effect. We are currently expecting, I hear it has been secured, $800 million from the World Bank. Well, that is good. But what do we do with it? Do we use conditional cash transfer as is being recommended? I think that money can be plowed into more meaningful areas. And I give an example. $800 million today, if you use 750 to convert, that gives you around 600 billion naira. Now, 600 billion naira, if you divide it by 774 local government areas we have in this country, that means each local government can get about 750, 770 million, billion, naira. Okay, imagine giving a local government 750 million naira, and possibly the government can also look for the balance of maybe 250 and make it 1 billion. So if you put 1 billion naira in each of the local government areas in the country today, in areas of health and education, for example, okay, in education, it can be used to maybe set up skill acquisition centers in each local government. passing the money not through governors, not through local government chairmen, but through maybe religious leaders and the traditional institutions, or even getting the World Bank to directly, see to the implementation of these things, themselves. So I think we should have a better way of addressing this issue of, palliatives rather than using, the cash. So non-cash palliatives should be emphasized. And this point is even included or mentioned clearly in the policy advisory. The policy advisory document of the president, clearly says deploy non-cash palliatives and not cash palliatives. The policy advisory document talks about implement minimum wage, before effecting this bullet removal of fuel subsidies. So I think it is in the interest of this economy. It is the interest of lifting people out of poverty, because again, the government is targeting lifting 100 million people out of poverty over the next 8 years, creating 50 billion jobs. That cannot happen, okay, if we have all these reforms coming at the same time without necessarily putting in place means by which we can cushion. If I'm permitted to continue, there are other recommendations in that report which I think are not really in the interest of poverty alleviation, because we have a peculiar case in our own economy. What works in some other economies may not necessarily work here, given our peculiar circumstances. Maybe I will come to that much later.
Yes, you will. And Professor Uwaleke, I just want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with regards to your recommendations, with regards to how we can cushion the effect of these reforms that have been touted to or said to be very good and for macroeconomics, but its effect on the poorest or the most vulnerable in Nigeria. Now, you talk about cash transfer, but do you not think it's because of the way it was managed in the previous administration, the lack of transparency, and the fact that we didn't see an appreciable impact on the most vulnerable, hence the reason why you're asking or you're recommending that it should be done away with? Because when you look at the immediate impact for Nigerians, people need money. Before you implement that recommendation, share to the local government areas, before the projects are developed, people have already fallen into poverty, and that's what we're trying to manage. Do you not think that it should be taken side by side, or perhaps we should learn from the errors from the past administration and still implement that side by side, projects developed at local government area? And then when you're talking about local government, how strong are local government areas? How strong are those institutions? How well have we developed local government areas? How would we avoid government or that subnational government interference in the deployment of these projects you've talked about? Because I hear you, but that also seems flawed, because people need almost immediate compensation to cushion the effect of these reforms and policies. What do you have to say about that?
Thank you so much. Again, let me share my little experience. I was Commissioner for Finance in Imo State, at some point. And I remember during my time, World Bank was also undertaking some projects in Imo State. One of them, happens to be the RAMP, Rural Access Mobility Project. Now, the state government was not, of course, interfering in whatever the World Bank was doing, even though we provided counterpart funding. So the point I'm making is that the World Bank can also be directly involved in implementing these projects in these local government areas, that I've mentioned. And I've also said, in order to also promote transparency, traditional institutions and religious leaders, the communities know them, can also involve them in making sure that these projects, are well executed. So you avoid politicians, you avoid the government. So I think that is very, critical. The other issue about conditional cash transfer, you see, how much is even this conditional transfer? We are giving people 5,000. An economy where inflation rate, as the last month, 22.41%. What can 5,000 do for you? In credit administration, for example, there is what we call the PAT. If before you give somebody credit or before you give somebody funds, you should be after whether the funds will be able to also meet the purpose for which the fund is being requested. Okay, so if you are looking for money to do a project of say 1 million naira, and all that you get is 50,000 naira, then that money becomes useless. You end up spending it. So I hear that part of the conditional cash transfer is to enable people also invest in, small businesses. What kind of small business will 5,000 start, even in rural areas, in today's Nigeria, when the person you're even giving the money has not even eaten, has not taken care of, basic needs? So I think for our own economy, I don't think this cash transfer thing, has been effective. And again, as I said, we don't even have the data. The National Social Register we have just has 15.7 million households. The response one has just a little over 2 million. Okay, so I think we should think of other alternatives in decision making. Okay, once you've defined the problem, the next thing is to identify alternatives. What are the alternatives? You now analyze the alternatives, and of course, you choose the best alternative. The what we call the maximize, the criterion will now come in here. Okay, so there has to be alternatives when you're assessing what to do with the, in terms of palliative. It shouldn't just be the conditional, cash transfer thing. And you rightly mentioned in the past it has been plagued by a lot of, controversies. If you look at the social intervention schemes of the previous government, apart from the farmer money and the market money, okay, that had some impact, and especially so when the former vice president, was in charge. The other ones, whether you're talking about, especially the conditional cash transfer or the N-Power, all of them have one challenge or the other. I must also say the school feeding program also made some impact. So we should be looking at, deploying, these funds in areas where they can have, they can be maximized. I think that's the word.
All right, Paul, I want to come to you. We've been talking a lot about, the fact that we have, interventions that need to cater to our population. But I want to ask you both about the demand side of this equation, right? Because earlier, Doctor was talking about trade-offs. And economics, as we know, is a study of, how humans make choices based on scarce resources. What about our rising population? Nigeria's per capita, I think births per woman is about 5.3. Sub-Saharan Africa as a region has the highest birth rates in the world. I think Niger, which is our neighbor, is at 6 per woman. Chad is about 5.6 or so. You got Nigeria at 5.3. So the issue is this. Are we not going to be playing catch-up forever if we do not do something about population growth? President Jonathan, funny enough, back in 2012, he was flirting with the idea of birth control legislation, but he quickly walked it back because of the backlash. Thomas Malthus, who is a British economist, had the Malthusian theory of population, which was what was used for the massive Hollywood movie Avengers Endgame, where the villain Thanos snapped his fingers and got rid of half the population because he believed that a growing population was putting too much pressure on scarce resources. So is there not something to be said for trying to manage Nigeria's population, especially with our loose borders where you've got folks from Niger and other countries coming in? Is that not going to forever put pressure on these resources that we're trying to allocate across from palliatives and everything else?
Well, it's interesting how you mentioned the population conversation. I must tell you that by 11:59 p.m. today, we would have welcomed 60,000 new individuals to our population. Whereas all of those continues, by 2050 would have increased to become the third largest population in the world. By then, our population will be 400 million people. The question World Bank in its report did not address are long-term impact of some of the policies. I think World Bank in the recently released report, it's so short-term in its view, as it's looking at what will happen between few years and is not looking at what is the root cause of some of the challenges Nigeria is having today. 400 million people. Which school are we going to attend? 400 million people in less than 30 years. Which hospital are we going to go to if we have someone who is sick among us? Which road? Who will produce for us? And so on and so forth. All of these are not in the report that was shared by the World Bank 2 days ago. Here is the truth. Palliative has not worked for for countries with large population. It was tried in China and in India. Palliatives by giving cash transfer failed in both countries. Now Nigeria is trying to also emulate what has failed in another environment. I mentioned it when President Buhari administration started the palliative approach of giving 5,000 or 10,000 every 2 months to the poorest of the poor. And when I was asked, and I also made this, of course, in the print media, that these policies will fail. Today, I think we can measure how many people have been taken out of poverty. By 2018, we have 89 million people living in multi-dimensional poverty. In 2022 or 2021, that number has increased to 133 million. What happens to all the billions of naira that have been given to the poor in the name of 5,000 naira? As at that time, inflation figure was not up to 22.41%. Today, inflation has since increased and remained double digit. We want to use quick fixes to solve structural issues. It has never worked anywhere in the world. What we need to do as a population is to seek towards development while we ensure that our growth is sustained over a period of time. And if you ask me, what should we be doing? We should look at countries that have similar population in their region. For instance, in Africa continent, Nigeria is the largest. In Asia, you will talk about China or maybe India now, based on the recently released report that the population of India might have overtaken China. But what are these two countries doing? You see, India is having significant growth. China, at a time, held sway in the entire Asian continent. So, but if you look at Europe, you see Russia, you see Germany. What are these countries doing that we are not doing? The country have built the foundation for development. Nigeria, however, is shying away from it. If I have time, I will tell you what those foundations are. And all of this, if we talk of all of those things, from energy supply, affordability of energy, and all of those, and we don't talk about controlling population, we are still not serious about looking after or about discussing the development of this nation. But here is the real conversation. The real conversation is that in the 40s, when we had the end of the Second World War, the entire Europe, and I'm talking of countries that many Nigerians, want to be in today, but a number of years ago, those countries were war-torn. Nobody wants to visit there. In fact, it was a difficult thing to be a woman in Europe immediately after the war. The question is, what policy was formulated that just less than 25 years, Europe came out of war impact and the entire region became a strong economic zone. What did they do? They focused on developing infrastructure, which is evident in rail, which is evident in power, energy, which is evident in solving their real issues. It was not about where people came from. It was about competence. It was about growth. It was about sustaining it. That is not what we are saying in Nigeria. The real conversation, again, is about manufacturing. When you go to India and China now, the focus is on manufacturing to help the growing population reduce importation. Because now that we have unified exchange rate, and I see a lot of people say it's a good policy, and people have asked me, is it a good policy or a bad policy? My position has been there is a fair policy. For me, if you want to say it is good, I will ask you that central bank told us many years ago that it does not believe in the parallel market rate. Today, that parallel market rate seems to be the benchmark for our official rate. What has changed in the last few years? The parallel market rate we said we will never recognize is not what we are hoping to match with after the same institution said that parallel market rate is no longer level. And we have said that you cannot deny your nose, or you cannot spite your face, or by cutting away your nose, I beg your pardon. The truth is that rate exists. But what must we do to even reduce the impact of all of these countries that are not producing enough, that want to float our currency? We risk danger of endless devaluation. That is what Nigeria is at risk of doing today. You see, when that policy was announced by Central Bank of Nigeria, in less than 48 hours, exchange rate went to about 600 naira to the dollar. And today, we're having over 700. When you leave this exchange rate to remain the same, we will be like that dog that is chasing his own tail. When are we going to catch up with our tail? By saying that, don't worry, it is cool. As long as we can float our currency, policy will we attract enough investor? The question is, there are other factors that are not making Nigeria to attract investment as much as we should. FX is one and is important. But when we read the National Bureau of Statistics report, and I think that is important for those in authority to be conversant with reports that are coming from both local and international agencies. When you read that report, it was revealed that there are other factors that is not making Nigeria to be attractive enough for investment to come. As a matter of fact, Central Bank have also released similar report saying that yes, FX is key, but there are other factors that we need to deal with. If we don't deal with them, even though we say we have devalued, we are going to see some level of investment in portfolio investment. But what happens to risk sector? What happens to other investment? These are conversations and issues that we must deal with as a country for us to have a greater nation than we currently have.
All right. Well said. Well said, Doctor.
I thought you wanted Professor Uwaleke to also comment.
Okay. Yes, Professor Uwaleke, do you want to weigh in on the population matter as well, please?
Oh, thank you, Rifa. Yes, of course I do. As a matter of fact, population should be seen as an asset, not a liability. 2 years ago, the former President Obasanjo, did a project on, with this title, Population as an Asset. He got Professor Peter Okebokola, the former NUC Executive Secretary, to coordinate it for him, involving 20 professors across Africa, studying how population can be used to leverage to become an asset. And I was privileged to be one of the professors that worked on that project. You see, population should be seen as an asset. And that also speaks to human capital development, particularly education. You can also connect this with the recommendation I just made earlier. Imagine having in each of the local government areas in this state, skill acquisitions, mega skill acquisition centers. It can either be at a post-secondary level or even tertiary level. So when people are equipped with skills, of course, there can be liabilities. And when they decide to go abroad, when they are buying, as the case may be, you don't have to worry, because you also have people that will also hold forth, within your economy, and eventually the ones that also go outside, eventually that will also, translate by way of, foreign, by way of, diaspora, remittances. So I think essentially population should be seen as an asset, and I think why we tend to see population as a challenge again has to do with the structure of our economy. You see, the economy, you can divide it into three basic sectors, whether it's the agriculture, industry, and the services sector. Okay, you can also look at it in terms of primary sector, which is the agriculture and mining, the secondary sector, which is manufacturing, and then the services sector, which is the tertiary. Now, the economy is weighted on the services sector, contributing 57%, to GDP. But that's not the problem. The problem is that the other sectors, the productive sectors, the agriculture and industry sectors are not growing. Okay, if you check the last GDP report by the National Bureau of Statistics, Q1, agriculture is actually entered the negative territory in Q1, minus 0.9%. You look at industry just managed to eke out 0.3%. So when you have these productive areas not growing in the negative territory, tell me, how do you grow as an economy? How do you achieve inclusive growth? Because inclusive growth is the one that creates job opportunities. So I think it's time we did something about the structure. It's time we paid attention to industrialization. Okay, it's time we paid attention to agriculture, contributing just 21%, to GDP. And that brings me to the recommendation again. I said I saw in that World Bank, report, recommending that with respect to the 43 items, the central bank should further liberalize the forex market, throw it open so that the 43 items that are ineligible for forex can now also access forex. I'm not too sure they also looked at the impact of that. The argument, could be that whatever effect it's going to have has already passed through, okay? Because those firms must have been also assessing forex from the parallel market, but that's not the point. The point is, what is going to be the impact on, production locally, okay? As we speak, some of the items that were made ineligible, such as toothpick and the rest of them that we can produce here, we understand 1 or 2 factories have started doing so. In Cross River, for example. Now, when you now, make it open again and then readmit them, okay, have you also considered the fact it's going to have on import substitution? Of course, they have said the fiscal policies can be used to address that. Tariffs can be, imposed. But what is important is that policy also achieved, some objective. Now, the other issue also has to do with, recommendation that the central bank should reorient monetary policy in order to anchor the exchange rate. What that means is that the central bank should now begin to also use the policy tool, which is the MPR. So as far as the World Bank is concerned, my reading of that is that the MPR rate at 18.5% is not high enough. It means central bank should further increase the monetary policy rate to be able to anchor exchange rate and anchor inflation. But of course, we also know the policy rate has failed as a tool, a traditional tool for taming inflation. And why is that so? Because of the other factors too that affect inflation. Because of the structural issues that affect inflation, the supply side issues. And of course, we know that this inflationary pressure is even more on food. Food inflation today is 24.9%. In some areas, like in Ondo, for example, is more than 30%. In Kogi State, it's 29.5 or 9%. So the pressure is on food. Using the MPR will be ineffective in taming inflation again when you know that there's insecurity, affecting food outputs in the country. So that's why I said that the analysis I saw in that report, although good, in my view, we are not quite holistic, we are not quite complete. They didn't take into cognizance our peculiar, circumstances, in Nigeria here. It's not about a one-size-fits, a cap. Okay? So we should, whatever thing we are recommending, we should take into cognizance our peculiar situation. After all, economics is social science, remember, that studies human behavior. And that aspect of human behavior must be recognized.
Professor Uwaleke.
Thank you, Doctor.
I want Paul Alaje, in the remaining 3 minutes that we have on this conversation, to also comment on some of the recommendations. I was going to bring up the recommendation by the lead economist of the World Bank in Nigeria, which Prof just addressed, about, look, the prohibition list of 43 items should go. Do you share his view? Do you also share the view, also expressed by the lead economist, that, look, the high inflation will only be in the short term, but that by the medium term, there will be disinflation as a result of recent, policies introduced by President Tinubu?
Well, I must say that this is not the first time World Bank, and more importantly IMF, have said that inflation will only be in the short term, and that in the medium term, inflation is expected to slow. I must say also that World Bank in this report has only examined only two policies, which is unification of FX and the price of PMS, which is subsidy removal. When they consider other factors, which includes increase of cost of energy, talking about electricity, by 40%. Some of the things, the inflation we are seeing at 22.41% may increase as high as 30%. So some of the projection of the World Bank will no longer be relevant based on what is what we are expecting as a nation. So they mentioned the issue of the items that have been excluded from access to FX through the central bank window or through the I&E window. I think for now it would be too quick for us to say we want to consider that those items. I think what we should do is perhaps to see with the impact, because all of those items we further push put pressure on demand. And when demand increases, while supply remains constant, the challenge will be that the price of the dollar to naira would increase. So you will need to now pay more naira that will be pursuing the dollar. I understand that there is this theory as to, don't worry, whatever naira is to the dollar is not our problem. This is Nigeria, we don't spend naira. Anybody that tells you that is lying to you. I will tell you why. The reason is because when you allow FX to, when you allow your FX to be devalued to any amount, what the first implication of that devaluation will be what will happen to your debt profile. Already, between last week, 2 weeks ago and now, the debt profile of Nigeria has increased between 2 to 3 trillion naira by borrowing no money. And I'm not referring to $500 million that was in the news. I'm saying that all the money that we borrowed from outside Nigeria, by the time you change the exchange rate multiplier from 461 to about 720 or 600 as the case may be, what we have is between 2 trillion naira to 3 trillion naira adding to our debt profile. So I don't think that we should further put pressure on the demand side. I think we should get to a point of stabilization. And I must say very quickly, I don't know if I have opportunity to say this again, that allowing the naira to float permanently is dangerous, not just for Nigeria, but for any African country. The reason is because of our production potential. Few African countries have started getting that correctly, such as Morocco and a few other ones. But as we are gradually moving into Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and the execution of Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and Africa is still challenged with power supply, is still challenged with production, capacity to produce, and so on and so forth. We will be shooting ourselves on the foot if we allow our exchange rate to float. I agree that we can run a managed float. It's fine that we have floated this time, but if we leave it like that permanently, I'm afraid when next we're having conversation, I hope it will not be 800, if not 1,000.
Noted. Paul Alaje, thank you very much indeed. I would like to thank you, Paul Alaje, for your contributions, and also Professor Uche Uwaleke. Thank you very much indeed.